a yard, ever so hard. 18 naked cowboys in...
We talked about this!
18 naked cowboys... 18 naked cowboys in the showers of Ram Ranch. And welcome back to Devlog. In the last part I worked on the clay level, and in this part I work on accessibility options and how to make my game more accessible for players to play with accessibility options. Accessibility in video games and the ability to control your difficulty in video games is quite important, and I will know this firsthand because over the past few months I've been devouring my fingers slowly like little baby carrots, and I now only have stumps on the end of my wrists. This makes playing video games quite difficult, as you would imagine, and therefore accessibility options, or an ability to edit a game's difficulty in any meaningful way, is pretty important for the game design process. Accessibility options are just generally important because different kinds of players may play your game, and if an option enables a player to maybe play the game in a more enjoyable or comfortable way, then it makes sense to allow the player to do it in such a way. You may be saying that these options seem like cheats, and shut up, they're not. Realistically, a player could enable all of these accessibility options as a way to cheat through the game, but to that I say, I don't care very much. If a player has more fun playing through my game completely invincible and immune from hazards and able to dash infinite numbers of times in midair and throw potions at infinite speeds, then no, I don't care. They had fun playing the game. It's just another way that a player can play the game, and if they enjoy or prefer it, then good for them. The first accessibility option is one that you cannot even enable or disable in my game, and the reason for this is because it's an issue I have been having in testing the game that I wanted to change to make the game more accessible and easy to play without actually having any indication of this happening in-game, and this being attack tracking. I found when attacking enemies in the way of using the dash inputs, there was some awkward maneuverability where I would not hit the enemy exactly as I would want, or I would miss the enemy, or I would get very close to them and then miss or get hit by them from the momentum of my attack when I was very close to hitting them. So I wanted to make it so that targeting enemies when dashing is slightly easier. This is a pretty easy system to implement and was done in two different ways. There is on-ground dash tracking and there is in-air dash tracking. On-ground dash tracking is very simple. If an enemy is to the right or left of the player relative to the direction they are dashing in, I will just move the player in this direction towards the enemy slightly more than they usually would, so when dashing towards an enemy, they move slightly faster if an enemy is actually there that they can hit. This is not super noticeable, it's just if there is an enemy that you want to hit with a dash when you're on the ground, there is an increase that you will actually be able to hit the enemy now. When dashing in air, this one's slightly more complicated. I have to search for every single enemy in the direction that the player is dashing in a radius, so not the entire scene, just in a specific section of the scene. I will then find the closest enemy that the player can actually dash into. So if the enemy that is closest is blocked by a wall and the player wouldn't be dashing towards that, I will pick the next closest one that the player can dash into. When searching for enemies, we also search for things like breakable barrels that can be broken, or other things that can be dashed into. When I say enemies, that's just a coding term for anything the player can break with their little old meaty paws. We then have a list of the closest enemies the players can dash into. We will then check if any of these are enemies, and if they are enemies, we will check if any of these will hurt the player by dashing into them. For example, metal enemies, when dashing into them, will kill the player. These enemies we don't want to track the player towards, so we will ignore these when player tracking. We will then find the closest enemy that is not blocked by something and will not kill the player when they touch them, and then we will just move the player more in that direction when dashing. One nuance to this is that when dashing and applying tracking, I don't actually manipulate the player's speed or momentum values in any way. I will just move them slightly with coding. Ordinarily, the player would have their momentum altered to have these kind of boosts or momentum tracking in specific ways, but I didn't want to do this because this would be altering the physics that the player operates under. And there's two reasons for not wanting to do this with the tracking. The first being that it would probably cause some cataclysmic error in some other system, and I didn't want to bother trying to fix that. And the main reason is that I thought it would be a bit unfair and inconsistent if the player was having an inconsistent amount of speed added due to tracking. The player being able to move slightly more towards an enemy when tracking is perfectly fine in my opinion, because it's not too much of a hazard to do in-game and will not really change movement slightly too much, but having speed altered would actually manipulate the game's movements too much and would make the game inconsistent to play, in my opinion. The next thing I added is potion tracking. I have no idea if I have mentioned this in a devlog before, because I had a potion tracking maybe 4 months ago and did not mention it, but it makes sense in the accessibility video, so I'm going to talk about it. When throwing a potion, the player can throw potions. Potions break things. When throwing a potion, the potion will check for enemies or things it can break in the direction of its movement. It will then slightly move towards these so the player can easily hit enemies or breakable objects slightly more easily than they would have to when aiming a potion. Potions are silly and inconsistent and bounce off themselves and bounce off objects, so it's not like a game like, for example, Shovel Knight, where you can play as Plague Knight and throw potions in a very consistent way because of game design. Potions in Pep-Pel are silly and dumb and inconsistent and bounce around everywhere, so having them actually track towards enemies is perfectly fine and honestly doesn't really visually impair the movement of potions. There are some instances where I have thrown potions in devlogs where if you were to really look towards them, you can very clearly tell it's tracking around certain things, or I will stand still and throw a potion and I will somehow be able to hit boxes in 3 different places, but this is just to make the potions easier to use and track towards things. You may say that this is reducing the skill of Pep-Pel, but the skill of potions has never been having the potions accurately hit things. It has just been that you have to halt your movement to throw a potion in a specific direction. As long as the direction is roughly towards the thing you want to hit at, and as long as the distance the player is away from the thing is the distance of the potion's throwing force, then you'll be perfectly fine throwing a potion as normal, and the tracking isn't going to increase or decrease the difficulty, it's just going to make it a little bit easier to actually use potions. Going over the actual accessibility options that the player can enable or disable in-game, there is faster potions, extra health, invincibility, and infinite dashes. These are all exactly what they sound like. The infinite dashes in midair means that you don't have to return to ground before using another dash in midair. You can just use one after another for as many as you want to. This is obviously useful because you can basically hover in midair with this ability, and you can readjust your movement with any number of dashes once you are in midair. So you miss a target when dashing in midair, you can just dash again or dash backwards or dash upwards when you're about to hit a spike. It makes movement in midair a lot easier. Extra health is very simple as well. Whenever spawning in, the player is given a suit of armor immediately, which acts as an extra amount of health. The armor works where the player can ignore 1 hit of damage and then the armor breaks, so the player will always have access to this whenever they respawn into the area of the game. So they would have an extra hit of damage, they would take damage, they would die, then upon respawning they have their armor reapplied to the character. This makes hazards and going through areas slightly easier and more manageable for players. Invincibility is a very fun one. You don't take damage at all. Ever. The only thing that can damage the player is instant kill hazards, but those are only related for hazards that would actually damage gameplay movement, such as being squished by an object or going out of bounds and hitting out of bounds. triggers. But mostly, this just allows you to walk on spikes, walk up to enemies, or do anything that would regularly harm the player, ignoring any hazards. And finally, I have faster potions. This one makes it so the player will throw potions at a much faster pace, so you can throw potions every frame if you want to. This makes actually throwing potions and aiming potions a lot easier, because instead of having any difficulty with not having enough potions or not being very good at aiming potions, you can just spam the potion button and you would throw a very large amount of potions into the area. This one is not super helpful in the game. I mostly included this as an accessibility option because I think throwing potions at a very quick pace is really funny. I don't really foresee this helping a lot of players a large amount in opposed to the other accessibility options. This one was more that I included because I felt like it could help in very niche circumstances, but it's mostly just funny. Next is the logic for the actual accessibility button enabler. I elected to have this in the hub area for multiple reasons. The first being that the option menu is relegated to options that are universal across the game, that being button remapping, settings, quality, screen size, things like this, and there wasn't a section that I could enable for things that would be to do with the individual save slots. For example, save slot 1 may have all accessibility options, save slot 2 may have none of these. So I needed an option menu that could be specific to each save slot that we are currently in. One way I could have done this is by having a UI that is only available when you have loaded into the game, as in you are in a save file, and then you can access the accessibility options through this option. But I didn't do that, and I'll tell you why I didn't do that. It's because I didn't realize that that was a possibility until just right now. So what I did is add a button in the hub areas that will work with the player's accessibility options and enable or disable the usage of these accessibility options. This means the player has already loaded into the save file they're currently playing on, and then they can edit the accessibility options from there. They will already have a file selected, and we can just work with that one file for the accessibility options. This is all very simple. The accessibility option item object is just a button with a pipe and a potion. If the potion is filled, the accessibility option is on. If the potion is empty, the accessibility option is off. When the player lands on the button descends, and when the player gets off the button ascends. Then if you press on the button while it is ascended or up, you'll press the button down and you'll toggle the function of this accessibility either on or off. This plays through an animation of the potion, either draining or filling, and plays visual and audio cues for this. In terms of the actual coding for enabling or disabling, it just switches a bool from true to false, and then every script that would have information that could be influenced by the accessibility option will read the save file and perform its actions that way. The actual visual design for these is pretty odd, but it makes sense once you take into account the actual design for the hub area once I have made it. The hub area is going to be Pep-Pel's home, and all the portals are in her home. Pep-Pel has potions, they're on her belt, it's a big part of her character design, she's a little wizard. So the accessibility options are a type of potion or mechanism that she is using to fill these vials with some kind of magical energy that enables Pep-Pel to have funny magical accessibility powers. That's the lore reason. The actual reason is because I thought these would be interesting to draw, and then I got carried away with the visual design for it, just making a funny potion thing. I needed a button, I needed something above the button to display what the accessibility option is, I needed some way for this to display if it is active or inactive, so a big vial that fills or drains, depending on if it is active or inactive, I think reads pretty well. Each of these has a funny little scribble on the glass casing of it, which is drawn by Pep-Pel to indicate what the potion actually is, and also has floating UI text above it that reads very simply what the UI potion is. This is one of my favorite current design elements for Pep-Pel, this being what I would say a quite detailed sprite with a lot of intricate parts, and then a stupid little crayon drawing I did in 2 seconds drawn on top of it. I really like this visual style for things. The obvious reasoning for this is that Pep-Pel drew these on herself, and she's a pretty bad artist. So whenever you see these little silly crane drawings in-game, the reasoning for this is Pep-Pel drew those, and I thought it would be cute. I think drawing things with a slightly detailed look to them really gives me the excuse to occasionally throw in these silly little doodle drawings into the game, and the game doesn't look worse because of these. Finally, there's logic for how the accessibility options actually work. Very, very simple. In the HP script, we will read if the player has these accessibility options enabled or disabled. If the player has invincibility enabled, we will remove any damage from the player when the player has their damage taken function, unless the damage is an instant kill from a out of bounds object or a squishable object. Very, very simple. If player is invincible, return from the function. For the infinite dashes, we will just check when the player dashes, which would tick a ball from true or false if the player can dash when in midair. If the player has this enabled, we will just not tick this to false, and then the player can logically keep using dashes. For fast potions, this is also very simple. When we have this enabled, we will have the timer for how long it takes for the player to throw a potion just multiplied by 0.2, which makes the potion throwing very quick and pretty much just works exactly as it would with throwing potions very quickly. Finally, with the armor, this is also very, very simple. When the player respawns, they have a bunch of reset values. If the player has extra health enabled, we will go to the HP script, we will run the function for picking up armor, and that will automatically give the player armor. There doesn't actually have to be any armor in scene for this to work, we just have to run the one function that gives the player armor, and that works perfectly well. These are all very, very simple options to add for the accessibility, and they work pretty well. Overall, big fan of how these work. If you have any tips or suggestions for accessibility options you would like to see in Pep-Pel, or you think would be useful in Pep-Pel, let me know in the comments below. These are very, very easy to add, and I would be perfectly fine with adding more accessibility options. And that's it for Devlog. This was a incredibly easy function and system to add because, as I have said, none of the things that have been added for the accessibility has been overly complicated. In fact, the button for the accessibility option to be pressed and depressed and that work with the player's save file was the more complicated aspect of this, while the actual accessibility option functions was incredibly simple.